Everybody does innovate. Everybody sit up in place.
What happened?
Took our flag away. We had the only American flag there. And
they tore it down.
They tore it down. They beat us up. True paint at it.
Why did you ask him about the boys wearing a flower on one side of his shirt and a swastika on the other side? Why did you ask him that?
Oh, a song will lift as the mainsail shifts and the boat drifts onto the shoreline, and the sun will reflect every face on the deck the hour that the ship comes in, and the sands will roll out a carpet of gold for your weary toes to be touching, and the ship's wise men will remind you once again that the whole wide world is watching. The foes will rise with the satan in their eyes, and they'll shake from their bench and think they're dreaming, but they'll pinch themselves and squeal, and they'll know that it's for real the hour that the ship comes.
My friends, I am happy to join with you today in the largest peace demonstration ever held in the history of the United States. I understand an hour ago the estimate was more than 125,000, and thousands of people are still in the park trying to get here. And I think this is a magnificent expression of the outpouring of concern and dissent concerning the unjust, immoral war taking place in Vietnam. I come to participate in this significant demonstration today because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this mobilization because I cannot be a silent onlooker while evil rages. I'm here today because I agree with the poet Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in a period of moral crisis maintain their neutrality. In these days of emotional tension, when the problems of the world are chaotic in extent and gigantic in detail, there is no greater need than for sober thinking, mature judgment, and creative dissent. In all our history, there has never been such a monumental dissent during a war by the American people. Polls reveal that more than 10 million Americans explicitly oppose the war, Additional millions cannot bring themselves to support it, and those who do assent to it are half-hearted, confused, and doubt-ridden. Tens of thousands of our deepest thinkers in the academic and intellectual community are adamantly opposed to the war. Distinguished church and theological leaders of every race and religion are morally outraged by it. And many young people in all walks of life believe it a corruption of every American value they have been taught to respect. Let no one claim there is a consensus for this war. No flag waving, no smug satisfaction with territorial conquest, no denunciation of the enemy can obscure the billions of Americans repudiate this war and oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America as they watch their little huts burst into flames. And we see little children mutilated and incinerated with napalm. Even closer to us, our own neighborhoods and in our own families, we learn of American youth destroyed and maimed in savage combat. American mothers and fathers are given coffins and medals, crippled sons and pious praise. And yet many of them are bold enough to declare their sacrifice has no meaning. They have suffered the ultimate loss and from it feel a sense of no gain. There is a quiet terror in every draft-eligible boy as families contemplate possible death that waits in jungle depths for our sons and husbands. The American people have freely given their lives in many struggles where genuine American interests were threatened. In its deepest sense, the immorality of this war lies in the tragic fact that no vital American interest is in peril or jeopardy. We are waging war in a contest that is fully capable of resolution by peaceful means. I express here not merely my own opinion, but many of the thoughts of some of our nation's foremost statesmen, leading newspapers, outstanding historians, and political scientists. This judgment is shared abroad by heads of nations who have been our allies in peace and war. This judgment is shared by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Uncut. This judgment is shared by Pope Paul and countless eminent world figures. This war cries out to be brought to an end. One of the greatest casualties of this war is a great society. This confused war has played havoc with our domestic destinies. Despite feeble protestations to the contrary, the promises of the great society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam. The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed the promised dimensions of the domestic welfare programs making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. We have escalated the war in Vietnam and de-escalated the skirmish against poverty. It challenges the imagination to contemplate what lives we could transform if we were to cease killing. I do not say as some have tried. It is estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $52 for each person classified as poor, and much of that $53 goes for salaries of people who are not poor. And yet we are told it must be continued because in some mysterious manner, if we make a move toward peace without significant concessions from Hanoi, a catastrophic world defeat awaits us. There is not a shred of substance in this argument. The power we possess is titanic. It can neither be lost nor diminished by unilateral initiatives for peace on our part. It is hard to believe, in the words of Uncut, that the United States, with power and wealth unprecedented in human history, cannot afford to take the initiative. We took the initiative to enlarge the war on land, on the sea, and in the air. We are strong enough to take the initiative to end this war. I am not absolving Hanoi nor the Viet Cong of their responsibilities, nor do I condone certain rigid attitudes. I am not naive enough, however, to think that they will come to a conference table while clouds of bombs are driving them into bomb shelters. As an American, my duty is to speak to my government. Even if my philosophy is not welcome in another country, I must constantly strive to make it welcomed in Washington. Soldiers from some 10,000 to 500,000 and launch bombing in the North on a scale as vast as that in World War II. All of this reveals that we are in an untenable position, morally and politically. We are left standing before the world, glutted with wealth and power, but morally constricted and impoverished. We are engaged in a war that seeks to turn the clock of history back and perpetuate white colonialism. The greatest irony and tragedy of it all is that our nation, which initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world, is now cast in the mold of being an arch anti-revolutionary. Now, as a civil rights leader, I want to mention another thing that this tragic war is doing. That our nation cannot support both war and adequate anti-poverty programs. We can do both, but I warn that it is inevitable that the men of power... Fine. All right. How are you? Ladies and gentlemen of the press, we have just had a meeting with Dr. Ralph Bunch, and I would like to mention the persons who served on the committee: Dr. Benjamin Spock, Dr. Benjamin Spock. I'm naming the persons who were on the committee that just met with Dr. Ralph Bunch. Dr. Benjamin Spock, Mrs. Dagmar Wilson, Mr. Dave Dellinger, Mr. Cleveland Robinson, and Reverend James Bevel, all of whom are a part of this mobilization in a very significant way. The Secretary General, as you all know, I'm sure, Mr. Uncut, is in Afghanistan today, and he had the Undersecretary, Dr. Bunch, to receive us and to receive the petition which we presented. Now, I'd like to read the petition, and then you may feel free to ask questions. From towns and villages, cities, campuses, and farms, we have come in tens of thousands to march and rally at the United Nations in New York and at the birthplace of the World Organization in San Francisco on this, the 15th day of April, 1967. We, the participants in today's unprecedented national peace demonstration, although of many national origins, faiths, and shades of political opinion, are united in our conviction of the imperative need for an immediate, peaceful solution to an illegal and unjustifiable war. We are determined that the killing be stopped and that a nuclear holocaust be avoided. We rally at the United Nations in order to reaffirm our support of the principles of peace, universality, equal rights, and self-determination of peoples embodied in the Charter and acclaimed by mankind, but violated by the United States.
Reverend King, did you have any exchange with Mr. Bunch over your differences of opinion as to the course the civil rights movement should take in this country?
Well, I think Dr. Bunch cleared that up himself the other day, so I didn't say anything about it. He came out with a press statement that he thoroughly understood my position. And I've made it clear all the time that there has never been an advocacy on my part of a mechanical merger of the civil rights and the peace movement. I have felt, however, that the spirit of the civil rights movement should certainly imbue the peace movement and thereby strengthen the peace movement.
Did you have any personal exchange at all, sir?
No, other than discussing this petition, and Dr. Bunch made it very clear that the United Nations and the Secretary General are very much concerned about the war in Vietnam, and he made it clear that they were very frustrated and disappointed that they were in a situation where they see for the first time a war taking place since the existence of the United Nations that they've been unable to do anything about. And he made it clear also that Uncut is still standing on the position that he has expressed over and over again, and that is that we should cease the bombings, and the new position of a unilateral ceasefire on the part of the United States, which would be an initiative which we could afford to take.
Did Dr. Bunch express support for your point of view on Vietnam?
We didn't go into that. I'm sure he supports the Secretary General. He certainly implied that, and I think he said it publicly before. So we didn't go into any details on that. But I think I can be safe in saying that Dr. Bunch would support the position of Uncut.
Well, Dr. King, what is your position has been because of all of this today?
Well, I hope it will arouse an awareness on the part of many, many people in our country, and in arousing an awareness on the part of many people, cause them to take a stand in their own personal ways against what we consider a very unjust and unjustifiable war, and a war that is terribly damaging the soul of our nation.
Dr. King, what is your position as to the priority of the two movements?
The priority of the peace movement and the civil rights movement, I think from a content point of view, the issues are inextricably tied together. In the final analysis, there can be no peace without justice, and there can be no justice without peace. So I think both of them are priorities, and we've got to deal with both of them as basic priorities.
Did you say that to Dr. Bunch?
No, we didn't discuss that at all.
So you discussed with Dr. Bunch
Yes, sir.
medicines to North Vietnam. Do you support this?
I'm sorry, I
Do
didn't...
you support the delivery of medicines to North Vietnam by Americans?
Oh, of course. I think this is a very humanitarian act, and I think more and more our concerns must be humanitarian. They must be ecumenical rather than sectional. After all, these are human beings who are suffering. They are our brothers, even though we may disagree with them politically. And I think this is a marvelous act of generosity which I thoroughly support. Yes, sir. Someone over here.
Do you consider today's rally a success, Dr. King?
Oh, I certainly do. I think it's a marvelous success and a marvelous demonstration of a great concern and an outpouring of dissent on the basis of the wrong policy which I think we followed for all of these years.
Dr. King, you have been accused today by some sections of suggesting that in the manner of your presentation at the rally, you are taking a one-sided view of this whole problem. Would you like to say anything on that?
I've never taken a one-sided approach to this problem. I've always said that I recognize the ambiguity of the total situation, and I recognize that if there is to be a peaceful resolution, or if there's to be a negotiated settlement, there will have to be some give and take on both sides. But I think since we took the initiative in building up this war on the ground, on the seas, and in the air, we can certainly take the initiative in stopping the war. And I think there are certain things that we can afford to do which threaten our security in no way. And I've said all along that I'm speaking to America. I am an American, and like the prophets of old who spoke to Israel rather than spending all of that time speaking to Babylon, I want to speak to my own country.
Dr. King,
What happens now, sir? Is this to be the last demonstration, or are we to see many more like this?
Well, I think this is just the beginning of a massive outpouring of concern and a massive outpouring of protest activities concerning this unjust war. I can't give you any programmatic action right now or any dates for the next action program. But I would just say today...
The Chicago chapter of the Public Relations Society of America, I'm privileged to present to you one of the best known and most controversial figures on the American scene, Dr. King.
Estimated that we spend about $500,000 to kill every enemy soldier in Vietnam. And when we think about the fact that we spend only $53 a year per person for everybody that's considered poverty-stricken, and half of this is spent for salaries of persons who are not poor, it means that we have to rethink our priorities. And it is my deep conviction that if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight what I consider and will continue to say is an unjust, ill-considered war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, then we can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. And I'm convinced that our government is more concerned at this point about winning the war in Vietnam than about winning the war against poverty right here at home. Used for this purpose is now being used in the killing process. It's made for great problems in the civil rights movement, but it's made for great problems in poisoning the soul of our nation. And so as we go on in the days ahead, it seems to me that it is vitally necessary to see that the problem of the Negro will not be solved until billions of dollars are available to get rid of poverty, to make a guaranteed annual income a reality, for every American family. Now let me say finally, and I guess this moves in the realm of the mutuality of the destinies of white and black Americans. We are tied together whether we realize it or not. The Negro needs a white man to save him from his fear. And the white man, we are faced with the fierce urgency of now all over America. We are faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as a lost opportunity. Procrastination is still the thief of time. And we may plead passionately with time to pause in her passage, but time is adamant to every plea and rushes on over the bleached bones and troubled and crumbled wreckage of numerous nations and civilizations. Stand the pathetic words, too late. Omar Khayyam was right. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. That is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. And in Chicago and every city, we will continue to remind America that the hour is late and the clock of destiny is ticking out. We must make the right choice for justice and brotherhood. We must go all out to make America one, and this is what the civil rights struggle, or I should say now the human rights struggle, is all about. And if we will make the right choice right here in America, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood, and we will speed up the day when every man will respect the dignity and worth of all human personality, and all men in our country will be able to live together as brothers. Thank you. As you can well see, the visitors are far too numerous. I believe that I would have probably temporarily sacrificed my pacifism, because Hitler was such an evil force in history. But that is nothing like this in the situation in Vietnam, and I call for your attention as I try to set forth my thesis. I would like to use 3 biblical texts as a basis for our thinking together, 2 of which are found in the Old Testament and 1 found in the New Testament, about this tragic war. In international conflicts, the truth is hard to come by, because most nations are deceived about themselves. Rationalizations and the incessant search for scapegoats. Something is happening and people are not going to be silenced. We had a march just a few weeks ago where several spoke. Stokely Carmichael and I spoke there. Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I'm nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. They seem to forget that before I was a civil rights leader, I answered a call. And when God speaks, who can but prophesy. I answered a call which left the Spirit of the Lord upon me and anointed me to preach the gospel. During the early days of my ministry, I read the Apostle Paul saying, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I decided then that I was going to tell the truth as God revealed it to me. No matter how many people disagreed with me, I decided that I was going to tell the truth. I think all too many preachers, white and black alike, find themselves caught in the yoke of conformity, seduced by the success symbols of the world. We have too often measured our achievement by the size of our parsonage or the size of the wheelbase on our automobiles. We as preachers have too often become showmen to please the whims and caprices of the people. We preach comforting sermons and avoid saying anything from our pulpits which might disturb the respectable views of the comfortable members of our congregations. And we ministers of Jesus Christ sacrifice truth on the altar of self-interest, and like Pilate, yielded our convictions to the demands of the crowd. In his essay on self-reliance, we were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. So we have manipulation of the poor. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions without great difficulty. Difficulties in speaking out today grows out of the fact that there are those who are seeking to equate dissent with disloyalty. We are put in the terrible situation of having to go and do battle and fight and kill colored people and poor people who are in the very same situation that we find ourselves in today. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God, the brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak for the thousands and thousands of mothers of our land who must see their sons go off to fight an ill-considered, unjust war, trembling at every moment, not knowing what will happen to them. I speak for all of our boys on the battlefield and the millions of young men, promising young men, who must make decisions today. And those who say that we are enemies of the soldiers in Vietnam, I say that those of us who are opposing the war are their best friends. For what we are saying in substance is that it is time for our boys to come back home, and it is time for them to be able to grow up in a world of nobility, in a world of promise, and not have to give all of their days to something as negative as the killing process. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. The situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways. The New Testament says, repent. It is time for America to repent now, for the kingdom of God is at hand. We in the churches have a continuing task. While we urge our government to disengage itself from a disgraceful commitment, we must continue to raise our voices and our lies. If our nation persists in its perverse ways in Vietnam, we must be prepared to match action with words by seeking out every creative means of protest possible. And as we counsel young men concerning military service, we must clarify for them our nation's role in Vietnam and challenge them with the alternative of conscientious objection. And I say this morning that it is my hope that every young man in this country who finds this war objectionable and abominable and unjust would file as a conscientious objector. And no matter what you think of Mr. Muhammad Ali's religion, you certainly have to admire his courage. Now let me move on and say just two or three other things. We must real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white. Poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, and new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries to people who are not poor. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of there's something wrong with that press. And as if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1964. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was not just something taking place, but it was a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my stand and respond in compassion. My mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak not now of the soldiers of each side, not of the military government in Saigon, but simply of the people who have been on reality took place when it became clear to them that this faith we will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. With this faith we will be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid, because the words of the Lord have spoken it. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all over the world we will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. With this faith, we'll sing it as we again the pruning hooks. And nations will not rise up against nations, neither shall they study war anymore. I don't know about you, I ain't gonna study war no more. When you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children, the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now, I think of them too because it is clear to me, and yet our government refused to recognize them. President Truman said they were not ready for independence. And so we fell victim as a nation at that time of the same deadly arrogance that has poisoned the international situation for all of these years. France then set out to reconquer its former colony. And they fought 8 long, hard, brutal years trying to reconquer Vietnam. You know who helped France? It was the United States of America. It came to the point that we were meeting more than 80% of the war cost. And even when France started despairing of its reckless action, we did not. And in 1954, a conference was called at Geneva, and an agreement was reached because France had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu. But even after that, and even after the Geneva Accord, we did not stop. We must face the sad fact that our government sought, in a real sense, to sabotage the Geneva Accord. Well, after the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, the United States came and started supporting a man named D.M., who turned out to be one of the most ruthless dictators in the history of the world. He set out to silence all opposition. People were brutally murdered merely because they raised their voices against the brutal policies of D.M. And the peasants watched and cringed as D.M. ruthlessly rooted out all opposition. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by United States influence, and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that D.M.'s methods had aroused. When D.M. was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictatorships seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? It's a man by the name of General Key, who fought with the French. I think we must have massive teach-ins, because many people do not know the issues involved. And many people are not aware of the history and the development of this war. And I think those of us who are against the war and see the damage that it is doing to the image of our nation must go out to teach others. And we must have massive preaching, so to speak. And I think along with this, demonstrations can do a great deal to arouse the conscience of the nation on the issues involved. And I'm speaking at this point of nonviolent mass demonstrations that again will expose the evils and the injustices involved in the war. And of course, I would advocate, along with this, that those who are prepared to do it and those who see the great dangers ahead for all mankind would be conscientious objectors. Again, this is not civil disobedience. This is something that is justified by the Selective Service Act, and I would hope that many young men would consciously seek alternatives to military service. Ladies and gentlemen, I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here tonight, and how very delighted I am to see you expressing your concern about the issues that will be discussed tonight by turning out in such large numbers. I also want to say that I consider it a great honor to share this program with Dr. Bennett, Dr. Comminger, and Rabbi Heschel, some of the distinguished leaders and personalities of our nation. And of course, it's always good to come back to Riverside Church. Over the last 8 years, I have had the privilege of preaching here almost every year in that period. And it is always a rich and rewarding experience to come to this great church and this great pulpit. I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I'm in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. And some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I'm nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. In the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This speech is not addressed to Hanoi or to the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or to Russia. Nor is it an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Neither is it an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue, nor to overlook the role they must play in the successful resolution of the problem. While they both may have justifiable reasons to be suspicious of the good faith of the United States, life and history give eloquent testimony to the fact that conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides. Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, but rather to my fellow Americans. Since I am a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. That is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. And then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated, as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. For it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers, as I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men. I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. For those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader? And thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. As if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1954, and I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I'm speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong, or to Castro, or to Mao as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? And finally, as I tried to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. And because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. And as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand and respond in compassion, My mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak now not of the soldiers of each side, not of the ideologies of the Liberation Front, not of the hunter inside gone, but simply of the people who have been living under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now. I think of them too, because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution there until some attempt is made to know them and hear their broken cries. They must see Americans as strange liberators. The Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1945, after a combined French and Japanese occupation and before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. Even though they quoted the American Declaration of Independence in their own document of freedom, we refused to recognize them. Instead, we decided to support France in its reconquest of a former colony. Our government felt then that the Vietnamese people were not ready for independence, and we again fell victim to the deadly Western arrogance that has poisoned the international atmosphere for so long. With that tragic decision, we rejected a revolutionary government seeking self-determination, and a government that had been established not by China, for whom the Vietnamese have no great love, but by clearly indigenous forces that included some communists. For the peasants, this new government meant real land reform, one of the most important needs in their lives. For 9 years following 1945, we denied the people of Vietnam the right of independence. For 9 years, we vigorously supported the French in their abortive effort to recolonize Vietnam. Before the end of the war, we were meeting 80% of the French war cost. Even before the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, they began to despair of their reckless action, but we did not. We encouraged them with our huge financial and military supplies to continue the war even after they had lost the will. Soon we would be paying almost the full cost of this tragic attempt at recolonization. After the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come again through the Geneva Agreement. But instead there came the United States, determined that Ho should not unify the temporarily divided nation, and the peasants watched again as we supported one of the most vicious modern dictators, our chosen man, Premier Diem. The peasants watched and cringed as Diem ruthlessly rooted out all opposition, supported their extortionist landlords, and refused even to discuss reunification with the North. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by United States influence, and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that Diem's methods had aroused. When Diem was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictators seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. The only change came from America, as we increased our troop commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. All the while, the people read our leaflets and received irregular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They move sadly and apathetically, as we heard them, off the land of their fathers into concentration camps where minimal social needs are rarely met. They know they must move on or be destroyed by our bombs. So they go, primarily women and children and the aged. They watch as we poison their water, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas preparing to destroy the precious trees. They wandered into the hospitals with at least 20 casualties from American firepower for one Viet Cong inflicted injury. So far we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. They wander into the towns and see thousands of the children, homeless, without clothes, running in packs on the streets like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers. What do the peasants think as we ally ourselves with the landlords, and as we refuse to put any action into our many words concerning land reform? What do they think as we test out our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe? Where are the roots of the independent Vietnam we claim to be building? Is it among these voiceless ones? We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. We have cooperated in the crushing of the nation's only non-communist revolutionary political force, the unified Buddhist Church. We have supported the enemies of the peasants of Saigon. We have corrupted their women and children and killed their men. Now that is little left to build on save bitterness. Soon the only solid physical foundations remaining will be found at our military bases and in the concrete of the concentration camps we call fortified hamlets. The peasants may well wonder if we plan to build our new Vietnam on such grounds as these. Could we blame them for such thoughts? We must speak for them and raise the questions they cannot raise. These too are our brothers. Perhaps a more difficult but no less necessary task is to speak for those who have been designated as our enemies. What of the National Liberation Front? That strangely anonymous group we call VC or communists. What must they think of the United States of America when they realize that we permitted the repression and cruelty of DM, which helped to bring them into being as a resistance group in the South? What do they think of our condoning the violence which led to their own taking up of arms? How can they believe in our integrity when now we speak of aggression from the North as if there were nothing more essential to the war? How can they trust us when now we charge them with violence after the murderous reign of DM, and charge them with violence while we pour every new weapon of death into their land? Surely we must understand their feelings, even if we do not condone their actions. Surely we must see that the men we supported pressed them to their violence. Surely we must see that our own computerized plans of destruction simply dwarf their greatest acts. How do they judge us when our officials know that their membership is less than 25% communist, and yet insist on giving them the blanket name? What must they be thinking when they know that we are aware of their control of major sections of Vietnam, and yet we appear ready to allow national elections in which this highly organized political parallel government will not have a part? They ask how we can speak of free elections when the Saigon press is censored and controlled by the military junta. And they're surely right to wonder what kind of new government we plan to help form without them, the only party in real touch with the peasants. They question our political goals, and they deny the reality of a peace settlement from which they will be excluded. Their questions are frighteningly relevant. Is our nation planning to build on political myth again and then show it up upon the power of new violence? Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence, when it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition, and if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. So too with Hanoi, in the north, where our bombs now pummel the land and our mines endanger the waterways, we are met by deep but understandable mistrust. To speak for them is to explain this lack of confidence in Western words, and especially their distrust of American intentions now. In Hanoi are the men who led the nation to independence against the Japanese and the French, the men who sought membership in the French Commonwealth and were betrayed by the weakness of Paris and the willfulness of the colonial armies. It was they who led a second struggle against French domination at tremendous cost, and then were persuaded to give up the land they controlled between the 13th and 17th parallel as a temporary measure at Geneva. After 1954, they watched us conspire with Diem to prevent elections which could have surely brought Ho Chi Minh to power over a united Vietnam. And they realized they had been betrayed again. When we ask why they do not leap to negotiate, these things must be remembered. Also, it must be clear that the leaders of Hanoi considered the presence of American troops in support of the Diem regime to have been the initial military breach of the Geneva Agreements concerning foreign troops. And they remind us that they did not begin to send troops in large numbers and even supplies into the South until American forces had moved into the tens of thousands. Hanoi remembers how our leaders refused to tell us the truth about the earlier North Vietnamese overtures for peace, how the president claimed that none existed when they had clearly been made. Ho Chi Minh has watched as America has spoken of peace and built up its forces, and now he has surely heard the increasing international rumors of American plans for an invasion of the North. He knows the bombing and shelling and mining we are doing a part of traditional pre-invasion strategy. Perhaps only his sense of humor and of irony can save him when he hears the most powerful nation of the world speaking of aggression as it drops thousands of bombs on a poor, weak nation more than 8,000 miles away from its shores. At this point, I should make it clear that while I have tried in these last few minutes to give a voice to the voiceless in Vietnam and to understand the arguments of those who are called enemy, I am as deeply concerned about our own troops there as anything else. For it occurs to me that what we are submitting them to in Vietnam is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war.